stand by. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Becoming Big Bettable webinar. Today's event is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to Kristen Molyneaux. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 100&Change webinar series, Thinking Big and Communicating Clearly. My name is Kristen Molyneaux, and I'm a Senior Program Officer for 100&Change. We're really excited to have so many people on the call with us today to kick off this new webinar series that we're doing with our very first webinar on becoming and being big bettable. Before we get started, I just wanted to give everybody a few housekeeping things. So the webinar is going to be recorded today, and we will be sending out a link to the recording after the webinar is over, most likely on Monday. Additionally, we will include any other links to materials or resources that may be referenced during the meeting over the course of the next hour. If you look down to, I believe on the left side of your page, you will see an instant messaging Q&A window. Nobody has audio other than the presenter, so any questions that you have, please go ahead and submit them through that window, and we'll be monitoring the questions and kind of bringing them up throughout the entire conversation. So don't hold off until the end. Go ahead and submit them as you have them, and we'll work them into the conversation over the next hour. Finally, the last thing is that at the end of this webinar, you will receive a link to a survey. This is our first webinar, and we do value everybody's feedback on what we can do to continue to make this series useful and meaningful for everyone. So if you would take a few minutes to fill out that survey, it's about 5 questions. It should take you only a couple minutes. We would really appreciate it. So with all of that taken care of, I would like to introduce you to our presenter today. William Foster will be presenting on Becoming Big Bettable. William is a partner at the Bridgespan Group and leads the organization's Big Bet Thinking. He has worked with many philanthropic entities, but most notably has worked with the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help them create large philanthropic awards. Also, as a side note, William actually worked with all 8 of the semifinalists in our first round of 100&Change to also help them think about being big bettable and how do they pitch bigger ideas to all sorts of different donors. So he's done a lot of work in this space and has been supporting and working with 100&Change over the course of the last year and a half. So William, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you take it away from here.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to dial in today. I'm delighted to get to speak with you about this topic, which I think has great import for achieving the kinds of social change objectives that those of us at Bridgespan, at MacArthur, and you all on the phone, or computer rather, aspire to change. And of course, there's no more appropriate venue, I suppose, to talk about big bets than with MacArthur 100&Change webinar series. The $100 million award that Kristen, you all gave out certainly attracted a great deal of attention and a phenomenal array of really compelling ideas. So I'm delighted to be a part of this community and to dive into this topic here. I would really recommend for folks to please shoot Kristen your questions. It will be absolutely wonderful if we can, even with this technology, have a little bit of a conversation. And the role that Kristen will be able to play is to, in some sense, speak on behalf of everyone listening in. So I will present, but then she and I will converse based on the questions you have. So please jump in at any time. So the topic, big bets becoming big bettable. I want to start a little bit with what is going on in the world with big bets. Questions like, do they happen? What role do they play in achieving impact? And how does an organization know if it can be big bettable? So that's what we'll cover. And we'll go into it in as much depth as people like. What I'd like to start with first is, what do we mean by big bets? In addition to it being alliterative, which is nice, what actually does it mean? And what we believe is that big bets are significant philanthropic donations, so large amounts, that have the ability to catalyze meaningful change for organizations and social movements. A big bet is something that is meaningful to the donor, but more importantly, meaningful to the recipient, not just a small contribution to a bigger, a very large pool. For the purposes of this conversation, our information, our perspectives on big bets comes really from two places. One is the work we've done. So at Bridgespan, we are a nonprofit organization that works both with donors and NGOs on the ground, and have had the real honor and privilege of working with some of the most ambitious and impact-oriented players in those fields. In the last 3 years, we've helped to structure just a little bit under $1 billion per year of grant-making initiatives, either sourcing or helping funders structure them, or nonprofits develop and secure funding for them. So one part of our perspectives comes from that experience. The other part comes from actually studying the data that exists on this topic. So we built a database. A number of people actually listening in were part of the team that did this, but we built a database that looked at every single $10 million contribution or greater from any U.S.-based donor to initiatives or organizations anywhere in the world for a 14-year period of time, so 2000 through 2013, to look at patterns and understanding. Now, big bet is not the same thing as saying $10 million plus. The definition we believe in is what's on the page here, but in order to study, we had to build a sample, and it's a pretty remarkable sample. So that's what we want to talk about. Let's start with a little bit of good news and then get to some bad news. So what's the good news with big bets in the world? The first piece of good news is that there's a great intention to give away wealth. The page that is before you are signatures of Giving Pledge members. So everyone on the phone has certainly heard of the Giving Pledge, but wealth in the world is increasing enormously, and there's a growing momentum of major donors to pledge to give away half of their wealth. This is a cultural norm that's by no means fully adopted in every community around the world, but in a growing and powerful and important way, the very wealthiest people are saying that it is their intention to give away their wealth. Second of three pieces of good news. Actually, the number of big bets is increasing. So when we look at periods of time, the number of very large philanthropic contributions is growing. So from 2000 to 2013, the number of big bets and the value of big bets doubled and more than doubled from all U.S.-based philanthropists, individuals, institutions, et cetera. When you look from 2013 to 2018, where our data are only actually at the $25 million plus level, that trend continues. So the number of big gifts is increasing tremendously. And the final piece of good news, when you look at organizations trying to work on the most difficult and challenging parts of social change, or on multi-organization initiatives doing the same movements, a very high proportion of the most highly regarded social change movements and organizations have received big bets. They're in absolute really quite remarkably rare. So as one illustration, if you look at human service organizations in the U.S. that are large human service organizations, fewer than 2% have ever received a $10 million or greater philanthropic contribution. But when you look at various rankings and lists, go ahead.
I'm sorry, William. Sorry, William. I was trying to get in there. We had a question come in and wondering if you could just define big bet again. What is your definition of big bet?
Sure. So what we think of as a big bet is a large philanthropic gift that is meaningful to the donor and meaningful to the recipient, that has the potential to achieve some type of catalytic change. So that's how we think about it, and therefore the conversation that we want to have today doesn't have to be about just a strict dollar amount. It can be about any type of philanthropic contribution that does that. And when we get into the big bettable part of this, the sort of latter part of the substance, we'll really dive into what does it take to be able to put that kind of a gift to good use. For the purposes of analysis, though, for some of the broader trends, we really have studied $10 million gifts. And there are a variety of reasons why we picked that cutoff. But when we look at the data where we have samples of thousands of gifts that we study, we've used $10 million as a rough proxy for a big philanthropic gift. Does that make sense, Kristen?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Great. And so with that, again, that proxy of a cutoff, one of the things that our research found that was really quite remarkable is that these kinds of gifts don't happen that frequently, and are very unusual to receive. The largest organizations focused on human services problems in the U.S. almost never get them, fewer than 2%. But when you look at the most accomplished social movements or the most impactful achievements in the social sector, there's actually a very high prevalence of these kinds of philanthropic gifts. So whether you think about the marriage equality movement in the United States, or KIPP academies and the charter school movement, or movements on the global scene to address critical diseases, whether it's Gavi or other entities, you see a very high prevalence of significant philanthropic contribution. And working with nonprofit organizations that are themselves the recipients of this, we hear extraordinarily powerful stories about the freedom and the ambition that receiving that kind of support can give. Philanthropy, big philanthropy in particular, is a small percent of the overall mix of monies that go to address social change. But most monies are highly, highly restricted, tight in their margins, and therefore organizations think about the next output or outcome. And when an organization or an initiative or movement gets a large philanthropic gift, it gives a flexibility and a resource and an ability to think large that we hear leaders talk about as a key ingredient to really taking a leap. So the good news is that there seems to at least be strong correlations between big philanthropic gifts unleashing the full potential of movements and organizations, that from an impact perspective, these seem to be especially powerful. They are growing in number, and certainly in terms of stated intent, the wealthiest people in the world whose resources are increasing dramatically want to give away their wealth, want to do more of these. So there's a lot of good news in terms of the potential for big philanthropic gifts to be more powerful in the future than they've ever been before. But, Kristen, there's actually a little bit of bad news, if you will, where I'll just go to the next slide, which is there's something we call an aspiration gap. There's a huge gap between the potential and the intention of major donors and what's really happening on the ground. And the gap has two dimensions. The first is what's here, which is if you actually ask donors, or if you look at what they say in public, or what they highlight as their most proud donations and investments, you see an extraordinary focus on the toughest kinds of social change problems in the world. 80% of donors either exclusively say they care about very tough social problems, or, and that's 60% of this 80% bar, or another 20% say one of the two or at most three top things they want to work on is one of these very toughest social problems. Things from fighting human trafficking to addressing inequities in health and education, tremendously difficult problems. when you actually look at where the biggest donations go to, only 20% go to those kinds of tough social problems. The majority of the largest gifts go from U.S. donors to very traditional support of higher education, long-term medical research, cultural institutions like art museums, and that's not the desire. So there's a huge aspiration gap there.
So William, I have a couple of good questions that link to that. One is that one person notes that this is really great, that it's a huge proportion of nonprofit success. But doesn't this discourage social enterprises who are trying to actually achieve sustainability through other types of methodologies?
So is the question there, Kristen, then a little bit about social enterprises that are for-profit and other forms than nonprofit entities?
Yes.
Yeah. So this research is about nonprofits, and that's where I can speak from a quantitative basis. But I don't think that this kind of work discourages the support or success of social enterprises. In fact, one of the things that I would observe is that in our work with donors, the very same donors that are striving to give the biggest kinds of philanthropic bets to nonprofit initiatives or causes are increasingly and equally almost interested in other legal structures, right, in social enterprises, and that in fact they don't think about the buckets all that differently in their giving, right? And we see this in the formation of LLCs as opposed to foundations. So a statistic we don't have in here, I won't remember it exactly, but I think of the 10 most significant givers that have arisen since 2010, I think only 2 are dominantly focused on a foundation form only. So most have kind of multifaceted forms, but the dynamics that donors have in terms of, when we get to the big bettable part, the dynamics that donors have in terms of what they're looking for to make a grant actually aren't all that different from what they're looking for in a social enterprise. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect if we were to do this analysis and say of donors that want to make significant for-profit investments in social enterprises to address the most difficult problems in the world, there'd be an aspiration gap there too between what they've actually invested and what they would like to.
Great, thank you so much.
And I'll mention one other comment about aspiration gap, and then happy to pause for people to put in any additional questions on this. But the second bad news, if you will, or part of the aspiration gap is a separate gap, which is the absolute amount of giving versus the absolute growth of wealth. So if we flip back to that page of all these Giving Pledge members, these are all billionaires, all of whom have said they want to give away half of their wealth before they die. And we did an analysis to look at where their wealth was when they signed the Giving Pledge and where their wealth was in 2017. And on average, everyone that has signed the Giving Pledge has had their absolute wealth double since they signed their name. Some more, some less. So it actually takes, you can do the math, but it actually takes a very aggressive rate of giving to give away half your wealth within your lifetime. Now, we didn't look at the average age of each person here, so I can't comment on that. But wealth in the world is increasing more rapidly than giving rates are increasing. So there's all the good news about the potential impact of major philanthropic gifts, the desire to give them, etc., but the gap in getting that to the toughest social problems versus the wealthiest established institutions, and the gap between just the rate of giving it takes and the rate at which wealth is increasing means that we're massively below the full potential of big bets. And it's one of the reasons, Kristen, that 100&Change is so important, because 100&Change both brought to the surface incredible ideas, but equally importantly, I think put something out very publicly in the minds of philanthropists of, gosh, we can actually move significant amounts of money. So let's shift now a little bit to the why, and I'll just forecast with everyone after this next little bit. I'm going to ask each of you to think about for a minute what would be the big bet you would want to secure funding to advance. But why is there this gap? And we believe that this gap exists for two broad buckets of reasons. First are about mindset challenges, and the second are about deal-making challenges. And the deal-making challenges are the ones we'll dive into with more specifics. But there are really pervasive psychological or mindset issues for donors to give very large amounts of money to the toughest kinds of social problems. The first is the public risk versus public reward. There's a tremendous amount of publicity that goes along with gifts, and almost inherently tough social change issues, approaches to solving poverty, to addressing human rights, are controversial in their nature. And so when donors give $25, $50, $100 million to causes like this, there tends to be a fair amount of critique. There are people even supportive of the goals in the fields that are quite critical of approaches that are used, the tactical approaches that are used. When some nonprofits get gifts and others don't, there's a winners and losers dynamic where there are critiques the other way, whereas giving to your alma mater or to an art museum or not giving at all, frankly, doesn't attract the kind of attention that these major gifts give. I mean, the Zuckerberg Newark example would be one that's widely cited, but there are many examples. And at least until recently, giving massive gifts to colleges or established institutions never attracted negative attention. That's changing a little bit now, but the dynamic of giving creates risk to give to higher to the kind of social causes that many of us here on this webinar try to advance. The second is part of a movement that we, Bridgespan, have definitely been a part of, and I suspect many of you have, which is a results orientation in the nonprofit sector. Over the last years, NGOs and nonprofits have increasingly held themselves accountable to achieving social change, and we as a global community have looked increasingly to nonprofit actors and NGOs to create powerful interventions. And when you think about conversations perhaps that you've had with major donors, appropriately, there's lots of pressure testing on how it can be known that change can happen. If there's something to change the daily incomes of people in a poor country, how do you know that it will work? If you're addressing issues of educational attainment in the United States, how do you know it will work? These are important and good questions, and yet when we look at gifts that go to established institutions, similar questions don't get asked. So when someone gives to their alma mater on their 25th reunion, do they say, how will Princeton's educational outcomes change over the next years as a result of this gift? It simply doesn't happen. So for gifts to things that are not part of the daily life of a donor but are about changing the world, the bar is very high to demonstrate potential impact. And the final mindset challenge I would highlight is to ask about the level of investment in sourcing and diligence that goes on. What level of investment do philanthropists make to find the deals? And there's a sense, unlike in the for-profit investing world, when folks look on the donor side, or frankly when they look for their for-profit investments in social enterprises where impact is what's at the forefront of the mind, the sense that that hundreds of thousands of dollars could be spent to find the right deal seems almost uncomfortable to many donors, right, that money should be going to the investment or the grant for impact. Whereas if you actually look at the private equity world writ large, there's all kinds of data that show that in general it takes 2 years worth of professional investor time per closed deal. So just the level of time spent to find the right things is enormous when profit is the motive. So think about what talented people there are in private equity firms, and if it's 2 people years worth of time, and then think, Kristen, about in the philanthropy world, how many program officers could go 2 years to secure 1 grant, right? It just it doesn't happen that way. So let me pause there, Kristen, because I think there are a few questions coming in.
Yeah, that leads into this really great question that was posed, which is, given that there's a lot of different big bet options out there to apply for, and many of them take considerable time and effort, and often offer very minimal criteria or unclear criteria in terms of the competition process, there's a question about when the likelihood of winning is low, is there potential for resource drain as nonprofits feel compelled to respond to these calls for proposals, but recognize that they may not win? And then how can leaders in the field best address this issue of resource drain on these organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a huge issue, and not just a risk, but something that has happened with frequency. And it's interesting that the question was posed as or framed as nonprofits feel compelled to answer, because I think that's absolutely true. Certainly when we think about our clients, whether it's 100&Change or many other competition-like opportunities for big bets, our clients feel compelled and they're diving in, and of course there are very, very few winners, so there's a lot of time lost. So I would acknowledge that it's real, that in fact it happens all the time, and Kristen, you may even want to comment on this from the 100&Change standpoint, but I guess my advice would be to say that if the hours that it takes to enter the competition would be a waste of your time if you don't win, it may not be worth entering, because even the strongest ideas and initiatives and organizations have a very low chance in any of these. I mean, there's 1,000+ applicants for so many of these. But if the work that it takes to compete is helpful to you, regardless of whether you win, then it seems really valuable. And in fact, you have some control over that. So whatever idea you flesh out, that you detail, that you design, should be something that you'd want to invest and think about more deeply, even if you don't win that specific competition. And that would be because both it's a good idea, something you believe could advance and change the world, and hopefully because you believe that that competition isn't the only place on earth to get money for it. And I think we'll take another question or two, Kristen, but then I want to get to the big bettable part, because we actually have some data about who gives to initiatives with big bets. Prize competitions are a very small portion of that market. So I would say enter a competition if what you design you believe is important to your future and has pathways for support beyond the prize itself.
Yeah, and I think from a 100&Change perspective, we can just add a little anecdote to that, which is that we specifically designed the competition to try and bring as much value out to the process for all participants, regardless of whether they advance to various phases in the competition or not. And part of that was through all applicants receiving feedback. But the other part, what we've actually learned is that some applicants took the opportunity to do exactly what William just said, to pull themselves back from their daily work of being in the weeds and say, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What is our big idea? And even though they didn't advance in the competition, they actually then felt that they had a much stronger proposal and clearer pathway to what it was that they were trying to do. And they shopped that around to their existing donors. And what they found is that actually some of their existing donors said, we'll increase the amount of money that we're giving because we believe in this plan and we see where you're trying to go. So I do think that there are these externalities to the competition, but it's about thinking about it from a broader perspective than only the kind of, I'm entering this particular competition for this purpose. So I would 100% agree with what you just said, William. So we have a couple other questions. Some of these are a little bit more related to how do you think about success and impact of a project that is a big bet project. And I'm not sure if that's something you're going to touch on a little bit later, so we may want to hold on that question, but is that something you'd like to address now?
Yeah, let's hold on that question. It actually makes for a nice transition to the next section. Kristen, is there anything else we should address besides that topic before we move on?
So there's one other question here that I have around, I'm just going to read it. Have you explored the 5 or 10-year impact stats of social enterprise organization design versus traditional nonprofit organizational design, and which structure might be more likely to get a big bet?
It's a great question. I don't have any kind of comparative data to give there. So we don't have that data or those data. But I would say that it does seem as though for-profit versus nonprofit structures have different advantages for different goals being pursued. And part of what makes something big bettable is the articulation of why your model is optimal for getting there. So I don't have a quantitative answer to that other than to say it has to be part of the story and pitch. And that, today more than ever, it seems as though there's openness to investing across those. I mean, obviously, if you're looking to a major institutional foundation, like at least MacArthur outside of the 100&Change world, the structures are more rigid, but the bets that are growing are coming more from donors themselves, the people that have made the money being directly engaged in the choice making, and they have full flexibility.
Great, thank you.
Good. So the blue area below here, the deal-making challenges, really sets up the next section, and I won't go into too much depth to it here, other than to say, the other challenges, even when donors say, all right, I'm comfortable, with the risk profile and my own public risk, I'm ready to put big money into tough social problems, where do they find them? And that sets up becoming big bettable. And there's a chicken and the egg problem here, right? Which is that social problems, are so large and pervasive, whether it's hunger or lacks of human freedoms of one sort or another, even hundreds of millions of dollars can seem like a drop in the bucket. So there's almost a limitless number of places to put money. And at the same time, when you say, what specific, well-structured opportunities are there for putting philanthropy in to a sort of well-structured investment, donors don't have many of those on their table. And there's a huge sort of arms race inequality, if you will, here between the toughest social change problems and large institutional giving, right? If a donor walks into a major university in the United States and says, I have $50 million to give, what kinds of opportunities are there on your campus? There's a drawer full. There are dozens. And if they don't like them, there's a 150-person development department to structure something quite quickly. If a donor watches the news and is concerned about the refugee crisis going on in the world and says, I'd like to put $50 million into that, there are places to do that, but they don't have a natural connection to them. Things may not be structured in a investment-ready way, and if there's something that doesn't seem to match, the ability to respond is very thin. So there's this chicken and egg. Until there are more big bets, there won't be enough infrastructure to serve up big bets rapidly. But until there is that infrastructure, the big bet growth rate won't increase as rapidly as it should. And that's what we'll get into in the next section. So what I'd like to do now, we're just over the 30-minute mark, but I'd like to take a minute and ask everyone to think, and hopefully you have a paper or your computer by you, and just write down for yourself, what if you could get a philanthropic investment for your work, or if you're a social enterprise, a major new investment, what would it be for? If someone were to have $10 million or $20 million, what would that unleash for you that would be really powerful? And we're going to take just a minute here and pause and ask each of you to think about that and write that down, and then we'll move on. Okay, so unable to see anyone's face, I'll assume that folks have written some of these down. Keep that in mind as we go through the next bit. It might serve as grist for the mill with some of your questions. Now, for an idea like the ones you've just written, or an idea that any one of us may be working on, we believe that there are 5 elements that make something a really compelling big bet. The first is that it's an important problem, that it is ripe for action, that it matters, right? And that could be anything from climate to poverty to human rights to opportunities for breakthroughs. The second, and actually I'll talk about the first and the fifth right now, and the fifth is that there's a strong leadership team, that there's a team that is believable, that is exceptional in some ways to really address something. And what we found is that, in fact, on the first and the fifth dimension of the problem, there are many, many opportunities that, in fact, fortunately, the world is rich in remarkable leaders dedicating their lives to changing the world for the better. And that on the first, unfortunately, the world is rich in problems that need to be addressed, right? That there is no shortage of injustices that, if they could be righted, would be worthy of a life's work, whether you're the leader of the social change effort dedicating your lifeblood to changing it, or if you're a donor giving your wealth. There's no shortage of problems worthy of being addressed. So when we work with donors and when we see what kinds of initiatives get very significant funding, these two are both true, and they're not rare. They're not the thing that distinguishes the opportunities that get the biggest funding from those that don't. That, in fact, most of the quality initiatives being designed really do a phenomenal job at identifying the importance of the problem and articulating the strength of the team. And in fact, often they do too good a job of that. So in one story I'll share, a group working on climate change compellingly conveyed to a group of donors the importance of climate change as an issue. What would happen to the Earth if we have a 2 degrees Celsius, greater than 2 degrees Celsius change in temperature? And in fact made it so compelling and large that then when it got to the specific opportunity that was being proposed, the donors said, well, how much will that change of that 2 degree rise in temperature of the Earth? And of course it was a very, very, it was an almost incalculably small percent, because no singular thing can move the needle that much. And as a result, when we frame the problems too large, we sometimes exacerbate the gap between what we've now energized someone to address and what we ourselves can accomplish. So elements 1 and 5 are almost always present and can go too far. It's the middle 3 elements that are the places where we believe something truly becomes big bettable. And again, this research was done for nonprofits, but I know some of the folks on the phone here are social enterprises, and I would argue that there's probably things here that can translate. So what are these 3 elements? Go ahead, Kristen.
Before you go on to these 3 elements, there was a good question that I think relates to maybe your previous slide and when you were talking about kind of the strong leadership in the team. We have a question here saying, can you please define the type of infrastructure that would be acceptable in order to garner a big bet? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the team, talk a little bit more about the team and team structure, that kind of infrastructure that might be necessary.
Sure. So, I mean, first I would say what most people think, donors invest in a person, right? So the leader or small number of leaders of an organization or initiative are absolutely vital before you get to infrastructure. With almost every donor we've supported, at some point they say some version of that leader is the real deal, right? There's something about truly believing that person. This creates, by the way, a problem for multi-organization initiatives because often it's unclear who's going to be waking up every morning thinking about it. Real social change generally happens with more than one player, but when you're thinking about who you invest your money in, it's easier to invest in one player, right? Because you know they're going to be stewarding it. So this is a dilemma. But the number one criterion is the leader and do you believe in them. I'll present a little bit of data later that show that that most of the time there's multiple years of getting to know the person. But in terms of infrastructure of the organization itself, I don't have a specific recipe saying in order to get a $10 million gift, you need this kind of staffing and this kind of recipe. But I will share that on multiple occasions that the notion of a professional infrastructure has absolutely come up. So we had one donor that was about to write, it actually wasn't a big bet, it was a check closer to $5 million. Well, it was a big bet by our definition, not for this calculation here, but it was a $5 million check, and the organization didn't have a chief financial officer. They had a part-time bookkeeper, and it almost killed the deal because there was just this sense of the donor, how can I write such a big check when they don't have the kind of professional infrastructure and staff, I would imagine. And that becomes something more pervasive when donor and recipient don't live in the same country or continent. So there is some threshold of professionalism that's necessary. So hopefully that, if it doesn't give a specific formula, hopefully it addresses the question.
Great, thank you.
So let me talk. These are great questions, and please keep them coming. I want to just at least make sure that we hit two additional points, and then we can talk as much about anything else. I mean, the first point, the most important point, really of becoming big bettable, is what is the thing that is differentiating for a nonprofit or initiative? And again, I suspect there's relevance for social enterprise. And it is these middle three that I've just put up. The first is a point of arrival, and by that it means what is an actual knowable achievement where success, where you as a leader or a donor as an investor could identify success for failure. So it's not climate change, fighting the good fight because it's so important, but it's really what would happen. I mean, an example, by the way, of a big bet that the Bloomberg Foundation put on the topic of climate change was taking offline a certain number of the dirtiest coal plants in the United States. So they racked and stacked them and found the ones that were creating off-size contribution, and they framed their initiative around that. That's something that's, it's like a Jim Collins sort of framing. It's big enough to matter but small enough to win. And when we've reviewed pitches of even the most accomplished NGO leaders, the weighting is vastly more on the problem than it is on the articulation of the specific thing that would win. And in fact, typically this isn't a communications problem. Typically it's a strategic problem, which is that nonprofit leaders haven't actually said 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this literally is the goal. We're organizing our resources around it. If we accomplish it, we'll feel like we've really done something valuable. And if we don't, we actually will feel like we failed in our quest. That clarity around goal is absent. So if on the problem and the leadership team, most nonprofits do exceptionally well, most don't do well on these three. The second, the credible path, is obviously how to get from here to there. So if you said, here's my point of arrival, here's my goal, given the team and the assets and the resources you have now, what is the path to get there? And what are the winnable milestones along the way? A great example, in the United States, as I mentioned before on this, is the marriage equality movement, getting marriage legalized in the United States for same-sex couples. And in that was a very specific arrival point, a very tangible goal that was less than sort of the full battle of civil rights and discrimination that could have been undertaken, but also had a critical path, right? There were judicial and legislative options in 50 states, creating 100 potential battlefields. There was a sort of way to see wins along the way. It wasn't just 5, 10 years of work, 20 years of work, and then we'll see the victory. And the final element is why philanthropy. Why is philanthropy the important missing ingredient? As I mentioned before, philanthropy itself is a very small percent of all dollars going in to address difficult social problems. Government monies, international, multilateral dollars, small contributions, $100 contributions from individuals, regular people. These are all much, much bigger sources of funding than major philanthropy. So why would a big infusion, a big bet, make a difference? These three things are at the heart of what makes something big bettable. And if we think about donors on a regular basis seeing an overwhelming number of social problems and an inordinately large number of impressive, talented leaders coming by, how do they think about where to invest their dollars? What they rarely see is something that crisply says, here is an enduring change that we actually believe we can reach that is big enough to matter. Here is a pathway that doesn't have massive leaps of faith to get from here to there. And here's why we have a whole bunch of the ingredients that are necessary, but philanthropy itself is the missing ingredient. This is the role your money would play to open the possibilities. Those things rarely come together. In fact, I don't know if anyone on the webinar is a literature major, but I remember when I was studying literature in college, there was a compelling essay talking about how there were only a very limited number of stories in all of literature, right? There was the story of man versus society, man versus nature. I mean, there were only half a dozen true storylines. And what I would argue is that what most nonprofits pitch to donors is a singular storyline. And that storyline is, here is an incredibly important moral problem that you donors should care about, with a potential implicit statement that you should care about it more than you do with some judgment. We are an incredible team dedicating our lives to doing this and have some innovative ideas that are making a difference. Give us more money to do more of the things we're doing that make a difference. And that is, in essence, the heart of what most donors see as their pitch. And there isn't the crisp range of strategies that bring something other than do more work against massive problem, forever. And that's what working on these three can really bring to the foreground, a sense of something that can be accomplished with a credible path and a unique role for philanthropy. Kristen, let me pause there for a second.
Yeah, I was just going to say that raises a good question, because I think the way you just framed that kind of gets at a couple of questions that have come in around donors. So one question was, does an idea that institutionalized within the local authority carries any more weight? So I think what this question is trying to get at is, if you're working within a local authority, does that carry more weight? Or if you're working in local communities, does that carry more weight with donors? Then a separate question is, in Global South countries, developmental investments often tend to be much more effective for impact generation. However, it's much easier to get money for humanitarian and crisis-based projects And do big donors have a preference for humanitarian or development-based donations? But what I'm hearing you say is that what donors are actually looking for are teams and organizations that have a very clear understanding of what goals they're trying to reach, the ways in which they're going to do that, and can clearly articulate and outline that against a problem that they're trying to solve. And so it may be that it's less about what donors are focused on particularly and more about how you actually articulate what you're trying to do. Is that an accurate assessment of what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think that's right, Kristen, which isn't to say that donors don't have preferences on issue areas. Of course they do, right? If someone has, one of the reasons that so many donations flow to specific kinds of medical research is because certain illnesses and diseases affect a donor's family. Or you may have a rising billionaire in India that only wants to give to India because it's about nation building, and that's where they're coming from. And certainly there are all kinds of different biases that different donors have. So for sure, all of that exists. But what you articulated that we find true is that most donors actually do care about most things, right? That it's not as though the majority of donors are myopically focused on one or two topics, although I will say that that's what most nonprofits try and do to get their attention. You should care about this issue more because of reasons X, Y, or Z, and many issues are worthy about being addressed. We as advisors sometimes also start with philanthropists this way. Here are lots of topics. Which do you care about? And that's enough to get donations flowing, right? If there's a cause that pulls at the heartstrings of humanity, donors will feel that just like anyone else. And if there's an impressive leader, that's generally enough to get a donation. But it's not enough to get a big bet. Let me just share one more piece of data, and then Kristen will come back to some of the other questions because I know there were a couple more. But on this next page, we actually, what it shows is the results of some analysis we did literally on the entire database of $10 million gifts. It was thousands and thousands of gifts that we analyzed. And what we found was that in general, every $10 million gift a donor gave was on average the fifth gift to that recipient, and that it was a 10x step up over the fourth gift. So that the pattern wasn't, I had someone come by the other day and say, if I just got lunch with Bill Gates, I think he would fund this if he could hear how important the cause is. And that's just not the pattern, right? Rarely does someone meet an exceptionally wealthy person, they hear about the compelling nature of the cause, and they write a huge check. Generally, they've been educated and care about a cause, they've been impressed with the leadership team, they've worked with them, and then at some point they see an opportunity to create impacts that are just notably different than anything else they've seen before. And there's this not 10% growth, 20% growth, but a 10x growth in what happens. And what this actually represents, our team did an analysis, and I may be off by a number or two, but it represents going from the 50th largest commitment of that donor to the third. So the nature of the cause and the quality of your leadership team are enough to get you to be one of 50 gifts. Getting the middle three right is what allows you to be a top three gift because it's so rare.
So to tag onto that, William, we've had a good question about how do you actually get to the donors with the potential for big bets to be able to pitch them your idea? Since many of the big foundations operate by invitation only, and that includes MacArthur, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Brothers Fund, et cetera, that this person knows. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how people can get in front of the right kind of donors that are thinking about big bets.
Yep. And there's I wish so there's two answers to that, and I wish there were better ones than the two I'll give. The one answer is that it's very hard to get access to someone that's not through a personal introduction, right? So it's very hard to just knock on someone's door. And so if you as a leader are starting with no connections to anyone that knows someone of wealth, it's just extremely difficult. but that if you have something truly exceptional, you can move from relationship to relationship. There's one nonprofit client we have that is exceptionally sophisticated in how it maps its current supporters' relationships to other supporters, and incredibly sophisticated in how it thinks about what would actually be of value to the potential donor they're trying to get to, and as a result has better than most been able to get a current board member to create an introduction somewhere else. I mean, what you're really trying to achieve in sort of moving from relationship to relationship is allowing the people to make introductions that aren't simply a favor, right? If your supporters have to call in favors to get you to the next degree, it moves slowly. If what you're doing is is so well thought out and differentiated, it tends to be that it's less demanding. So it's person to person, and it just is what it is. I mean, that is the second is that there are a growing number of platforms, if you will, to elevate great nonprofit leaders, and that's both things like 100&Change, where even groups that weren't the winners, or even groups that weren't in the 8 semifinalists, got an increase in visibility. And Kristen, I know you guys worked hard to make connections with other donors, or groups like Echoing Green, which is phenomenal in elevating leaders. I mean, it's very hard to make the breakthrough, but once you can become an Echoing Green Fellow, or once you can get into the final levels of 100&Change, these are the kind of places that donors source all the time, years down the road.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm wondering if you have any wrap-up stuff that you want to get to before we run out of time.
The only thing I'll just say, because I know we're in the final few minutes as we wrap, is that these questions of big bets raise all sorts of concerns about the power of the wealthiest people on the planet, right? What is it that we're doing to position ourselves to appeal to them? It's an uncomfortable power dynamic. And that's true. But one of the things that I guess I would encourage, particularly the nonprofit leaders, separate from some of the social enterprise leaders, is that along with the underinvestment we've talked about in these middle three ideas, the arrival point, the pathway, and the sort of role of philanthropy, there's an overinvestment in praise of donors, right? So donors often get an enormous amount of reward from their grantees for relatively modest gifts, and I would just encourage the NGOs, as they think about some of the power dynamics, to take as seriously as possible the substance of creating the kinds of strategies that lead to realistic, enduring change, and at the same time to think about the balance of how they're appealing to donors between appealing to the heart and giving praise, and between really showing a pathway to achieve, have the reward be the enduring results as much as anything else. I mean, it's always a balance of head and heart, but I think we can bring, to go from being the number 50 recipient to the number 3 is not about the heart, that's about the head.
Great. Thank you, William. I also want to take just a quick second before everybody gets off. There were a couple of questions that were specific to 100&Change that I'd like to address. The first is somebody has requested whether or not we will be sharing learnings about 100&Change. So we intend to do probably a 100&Change webinar that's more about our learnings in next year, probably in Q1 of next year. But I would like to invite everybody to go to our website. We have been blogging and providing a lot of information on what we have learned over the course of 100&Change, what we intend to improve upon if we do this again. And so we would like to invite you to our blog. You can find that at our MacArthur 100&Change.org website. The second question is asking about whether or not this concept of a big bet likely to be a fifth gift and 10 times the size of the fourth and all of the things that William discussed, does it play out in MacArthur's giving? And if so, does this open to all-comers model of 100&Change? Is it misleading because many people do not have a history with us? And I would say that 100&Change is a completely different animal and is separate from our normal grant-making strategy. So for 100&Change, you do not have to have a history of grant making with us. And in fact, the award recipient did not have any history of grant making with us at all. And so it's a very different model. And we tried to do a lot of the things that William highlighted and that came up in the beginning with some of the questions around. We tried to be very clear about what our criteria was. We put that on our website. We were very open about who the judges were and how that information was going to be used and who was going to be getting feedback. So we tried to be as transparent as possible in that process, but it did not depend on whether or not you had previously been a MacArthur awardee or grantee in the past. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. And also to clarify the website, it's macfound.org. I just want to make sure everybody knows that. So there's a lot of additional questions. We've gotten a lot of, I think we had a great conversation today. Somebody has suggested that this was way too brief and that we should do an hour of content next time and 30 minutes worth of Q&A. So we will definitely take that under advisement and see whether or not we can make that happen. And I think I would like to go ahead and say thank you. I would like to go ahead and say thank you to everybody for joining. We will be hosting our next webinar in August. It is on August 21st, and it's going to be focused on theory of change. So one of the things that William talked about is how there's often kind of a gap in terms of thinking around the pathways to getting to the change. And so we are actually going to have Clemency Cosentino from Mathematics come and talk about designing a really strong theory of change and then using that actually for continuous program improvement. So not just putting it on a shelf and saying we did it and we handed it into a donor, but how do you actually use that theory of change to continue to build your programs and make them stronger. So that will be our next webinar on August 21st. Like we said, we will be sending out the video link to this webinar to all of everybody that was on today, as well as all of the people who couldn't join us. That will probably be going out on Monday, given that I don't think we'll get the link until then. So we'll send that out as soon as we have it. And we look forward to seeing everybody on the 21st. So thank you so much to William Foster for joining us today and giving us such great content. And thank you everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend.
That will conclude today's webinar. Thank you all once again for joining.